All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's February Nature and You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a conservation nonprofit based in Woodland. Our mission is to engage with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our region. The region that we particularly focus on is the northern inner coast range and the western edge of the Central Valley. And we particularly focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which is the relatively new national monument that runs from down near the southern end of Lake Berryessa, all the way up through the Cache Creek Wilderness and up to the Snow Mountain Wilderness in Mendocino County. Tuleyome does a variety of different things, including field trips for K-12 classes. We do hikes and trail building days for the general public. We, of course, do this monthly Nature and You lecture series. We're also leading a coalition that is advocating for the expansion of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument by adding the Moloch-Loyak region. And if you'd like to learn more about any of those efforts or support us in those efforts, you can do that at our website, tuleyome.org. I did want to briefly plug a couple of our upcoming events. So I'm here on our events page. We've got a hike coming up on the 9th. And then, all of you are here because you love wildflowers. And you're going to be hearing from Dr. Glen Holstein tonight. And Glen is going to be leading several wildflowers tours for us coming up this spring. So if you'd like to come out and see some flowers in person, be sure to sign up on our website. We also have our Spring Thing open house event at the Woodland Regional Park Preserve on March 23rd. That's going to be a great event with live music, a food truck, and lots of activities for both kids and adults. And so, without further ado, I will introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Holstein received his PhD in botany from UC Davis and retired from his position as a senior scientist with Zentner Planning and Ecology, a local biological consulting company. He is a volunteer board member for Tuleyome and is also a founding board member of the Stebbins chapter of the California Native Plant Society, which I think is now called the Yolo-Calusa chapter of CNPS. And so during the talk, if all of you could make sure your microphones are on mute, and if you have any questions, hang on to those until the end, and we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A with Dr. Holstein. All right, Glenn, go ahead and take it away.
Well,
I'm just going to get it on, but you can start talking.
welcome, wildflower fans. I'd like to show you this first picture, if we can find it here. Yeah, there it is. Well, Bob Gibbons is a Britisher who went around the world looking for wildflowers. And he published this wonderful book about the 50 best places to see wildflowers in the entire world. And an awful lot of them, over about 4 of them, were in our California region, including our Tuleyome region. So it's pretty remarkable that we have so many of these wildflowers here that are so outstanding that this gentleman that searched the globe for the best place to see them kind of focused here on California. Well, one of the reasons that we know so much, not just about California, but about the beauty of nature all over the world, is because of John Muir. More than anyone else, he taught the world that nature isn't just something to be used up. and devoured by people, it's something that has its own value and needs to be protected. And he started the concept of nature parks that started right here with him in California, walking across the Central Valley, and now is something appreciated by essentially every nation on Earth. Just about every nation on the Earth now has nature parks to protect the great diversity we have on our planet that is an oasis in space. Well, in 1868, he walked from San Francisco down the Coast Range, and then from Pacheco Pass walked east across the Central Valley to his target, the Sierra Nevada that he'd heard about, and the great beauty there. John Muir walked across the Central Valley at a time when it was very different than what it is today, a heavily farmed and urbanized area with irrigation. At that time, it was a pretty wild place. And what he found there was basically a wilderness with a few trails there and a few villages and small towns, but mostly it was flowers as far as he could see. Well, this is something that he described as bee pastures as far as he could see. And this was in the bee pastures that John Muir described that went on for miles and miles. In other words, those were native, beautiful wildflowers, many, many species that went on as far as he could see, being pollinated all around him. You know, you can actually still see this in a few places. It's not completely gone. It may be gone on that pathway across the Central Valley that he took from Pacheco Pass up to Yosemite, but you can still find that area of miles and miles of bee pastures in a good year in California. It still survives. And here is an example, Monolopia lanceolata down in the valleys of the Coast Range. Very, very much like what John Muir described when he walked across the Central Valley before it was irrigated farmland on his way to the Sierra Nevada. Flowers in the foreground, flowers in the hills, flowers as far as you could see. Something that really was unknown at that time because nobody had seen a place like this. They had, but nobody had described it as thoroughly to as many people as John Muir did when he wrote about California. And what he said about the Central Valley was something he'd never seen before because he'd actually walked across the eastern US before this. He'd walked from Wisconsin, where he lived, down to the Gulf of Mexico, all on foot. But this was something new, because this was not flowers amid grass, but grass amid the flowers, meaning that the flowers were much more abundant than grass. And actually, it's not just inside valleys. You can actually sometimes see this on the floor of the San Joaquin Valley. This is actually taken from the edge of I-5. Leia glandulosa, as far as you can see, very, very much like what John Muir described. A little further north, but this is an area that you can still see flowers, bee pastures, as far as you can see. They're still here. Well, he spent the summer up in the mountains, and when it started to snow and get cold, he walked back on that path through the Central Valley, and he found again bee pastures, flowers as far as he could see, but these were very different flowers, completely different. And he described what we now know as Holocarpa virgata, once again, as far as he could see. But this is one that you can still get out in the Central Valley and see this plant with a sheet of yellow as far as you can see. Here it is in the valley in the Coast Range. Here it is on the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Well, we don't really talk much about these flowers in academia, even today. And that's largely because of this man. He wrote the book really on plant ecology for North America, Frederick Clements. And he believed that if you have a particular climate, you have a particular kind of vegetation. And so he actually drew a map showing the kinds of vegetation based on climate. Forests here in the east, grassland in the Great Plains in yellow, green along the northwestern coast, the redwood forest up into the forest of southeastern Alaska. But here's a bit of yellow. In other words, it's the same color as Nebraska, but it's actually gerrymandered as if there was a piece of Nebraska right here in the middle of California. And because there was a plant called Stipa in the genus Stipa that was an important member of the grassland of Nebraska, he wrote that there had to be a Stipa here in the Central Valley because the Central Valley looked like Nebraska, even though it didn't have a climate at all like Nebraska. So we kind of got gerrymandered in to the idea that there was a grass called Stipa pulchra, blue needlegrass, that covered California. And so there became an industry. People planted it to restore what botanists following on Frederick Clements said was the natural grass of the Central Valley. And here it is planted, and even tried to restore the front yard of the Davis Post Office with the same thing, Stipa pulchra. But actually, if you look at a map where you can go to find Stipa pulchra, you can find a lot of it along the coast. But if you look at the middle of California, the Central Valley, where Frederick Clements said it was the dominant plant, you really can't find it. Very little up in the Sacramento Valley, mostly along rivers and streams and riparian areas, but a real void for this plant that supposedly was the plant of the Central Valley. To actually find the most common native grass in the Central Valley, this is creeping wild rye. And this one is a real Central Valley grass, native grass that you can find in even today in great abundance. And if you look at the distribution there, it's on the coast like blue needlegrass, purple needlegrass, but it's also in the Central Valley, up and down, all the way down to from Shasta County down to Kern County, and a lot in between. But it wasn't just grass, because what John Muir described was flowers, as far as you can see, very little grass. So how come what he saw was so different from what Clements said in his textbooks on plant ecology were the dominant plants of the Central Valley? Well, for a long time, people believed Clements had to be right. So they said, well, these bunch grasses, purple needlegrass, were just eaten up by all the cows. And by the time that Muir got there weren't any more bunch grasses of Stipa pulchra, and that's why there were flowers and other things. But boy, if you go up to the valleys, what you see is exactly what Muir described. But when they published a book about the terrestrial vegetation of California, they were still very much under the influence of Clements, and they don't talk much about all the flowers that Muir found and described. They talk more about what Clements said had to be here based on his climax theory. But it took Professor Richard Minnick from down at UC Riverside to really find out what really happened. It wasn't something that if you go back at some period around the time of the formation of California and the gold rush and cattle grazing, that once you had purple needlegrass and now you have flowers, what Richard Minnick did was to go back to the Spanish records of the very first people that explored the Central Valley long before John Muir even got there. And the thing is that these Spanish archives of the earliest people that actually wrote about what was in the Central Valley describe the same thing that John Muir saw. Flowers as far as you could see, very little grass of any kind. Little creeping wild rye, but nothing like bunch grass. There was plenty of bunch grass, but it was up in the hills, both the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevada foothills. And if you look at that climatic climax, in other words, the Stebbins or the Clements theory was that places with a particular climate had the same kind of vegetation. And he said, well, the Central Valley looked like Nebraska, therefore it had kind of vegetation with bunch grasses in the stipa genus, as he found around Omaha in the great grasslands of the central part of the United States. But here's the climate diagram of Omaha, where Clements worked. The lower curve is the temperature. And you can see on the left, it gets pretty cold in the winter, and then it gets warmer and warmer. And the rainfall follows that increasing temperature, so that when the temperature is ideal for growing plants, there's plenty of water to nurture those plants. Well, if you go out to California, you couldn't get two climate diagrams more different. We get the rain in the wintertime when it's too cold to grow very fast. And then when it's warm enough to grow, we don't get any rain at all. So we get this extreme drought. So the curves on the left, the curves on the right, that's when rain falls. The curve in the middle is the temperature, which provides warmth for plants to grow. And if you notice, there's little points, both in the spring, when John Muir walked across the Central Valley and found those bee pastures that went on forever, miles and miles of bee pastures. And that's when there's water and a little bit of warmth. And because that's a very short time between enough water and enough warmth for plants to grow, they have to get it over with very quickly, and they have to attract those pollinators very quickly. And that's one reason we have such showy wildflowers here in California, because they only have that brief moment in this kind of a climate to attract the pollinators. So he crossed the Central Valley at the same time those lines crossed on the left, and he came back across the Central Valley at the same time those lines cross on the right. He saw wildflowers at the rare time when you can get both warmth and water, so the wildflowers can grow, put out their flowers to attract pollinators in just a brief moment in time. Unlike Nebraska, which has warmth and water at the same time. So really, they put out wildflowers, but they don't have to be so showy, because the pollinators are there just at the right time. And it's not just a brief moment in time like it is here in California in our Mediterranean climate. So here we go with the California poppy. It has to put all that pollinating energy out in a brief moment of time between when the rains fall when it's cold and when the sun comes out, it stops raining and it gets warm. If it gets too warm and dry, they can't grow. If it gets too wet and cold, they can't grow. So they have this brief moment where they really have to put on a show. And that's what Bob Gibbons found, coming all the way from the British Isles to a place that he had never seen before, a place with the showiest wildflowers of any place on Earth because of that unusual climate we have. And the bulbs show up as well. This is Tritilia laxa in that climate. Once again, in that moment of time, all of a sudden, we have color crossing the landscape like John Muir described it in the spring. Well, here's something unusual about that kind of climate. This is the same moment in time in May. If you notice in the foreground, we have oak trees, and if you look under the oak trees, all the grass is dried up and brown. But if you look beyond the oak trees, except in the ravines, there are no more trees, but there is green as far as you can see. How can you have such different vegetation in the same climate? Well, the reason is the geology is very different. That water that falls in winter, when it's too cold for plants to grow very fast, has to be stored in the soil to be ready for plants to grow when it warms up and the rain has stopped. So there's a reservoir underneath the soil surface. And the nature of that reservoir in California determines what kind of vegetation you get. The area in the foreground is on volcanic rock with lots of deep cracks so that the water goes down deep where it can be reached by the roots of oak trees. But because it goes down so fast in these cracks in the volcanic rock, it doesn't stay on the surface for the grass to stay green very long. But the hills in the background are marine sediments rich in clay, and the clay holds the water close to the surface, and it doesn't allow the water to go down deep where oak roots grow. So it's not a good place for oaks. No cracks there. The water's mostly at the surface, and the plants are still green when the same plants at the surface, the grasses in the foreground, are already dried up and turning brown. So because of this need for water to be stored in different places, that's why we have such diverse vegetation here in California. You know this bright green grass in the foreground? Well, that's on marine sediments that were uplifted to create the Coast Range. And across Cache Creek in the background, no longer bright green, and all of a sudden it's trees and chaparral, and that's on Serpentine, a very different place for that water to be stored and a very different kind of vegetation, even in the same moment of time in the same climate. So unlike what Clement says, at least in California here, the climate doesn't control vegetation and plant life nearly as much as soil and geology does. So that's why California is a real mosaic of different vegetations. Here along Cache Creek, you can see areas of green meadows, areas of woodland of oaks, areas of chaparral, areas of foothill pine, and area of riparian forest or woodland along Cache Creek. So in the same climate here in California, you can get chaparral, you can get oak woodland, and you can get those bee pastures, those massive areas of wildflowers, unlike anything else that Bob Gibbons saw on Earth, and unlike anything John Muir had seen walking across the eastern part of the United States. Nothing like it there, nothing like it in very many places in the world. But it's still here and still valuable and still intact here in California in some places, even though lots of it is gone. You can see here in the foreground, lupins, in the background, non-native grasses for the most part, because in many cases, because of disturbance, the native wildflowers have been replaced by non-native annual grasses, which are very dominant, but they are not what was originally found here by the earliest explorers and by John Muir. But if you go to the right places, you can see still exactly what those early explorers wrote about and were found by Rich Minnick in the Spanish archives, and were found by John Muir many decades later when he walked across the Central Valley. Bee pastures, as far as you can see, that went on for miles. This is a little protected because it's on a hillside. It wasn't turned into irrigated farmland, so it's still there, but it's very much like what John Muir and the earliest Spanish explorers described. Flowers as far as you can see. And the earliest name for it by the people that were describing it before Clemens was California prairie, because it really is not dominated by grass, although today it's more commonly called grassland. Grasses that are there are, for the most part, non-natives. The native grasses are more up in the hillsides and not on the valley floor. But this was described as really an area that had even more flowers, in other words, forbs, non-grasses, than it had grasses. So good name for it. And the historically proper name for it, the first name that was given to it, is California prairie. Well, one thing about the environmental gradient in California, as you go from on the left, very high drainage with chaparral, in the middle, somewhat less drainage with woodland, where you have grass underneath it or flowers underneath it, and then oaks is an overstory. And then finally on the right, no trees at all. True prairie, when you have lots of clay holding the water from winter rains to the growing season close to the surface, because clay doesn't let oxygen through, doesn't let water through to the roots of trees, but keeps it at the surface for flowers and introduced grasses. You have the same situation with time. When John Muir first walked across the Central Valley in spring, he found plants like the Tritilia laxa, very colorful plants. In the summertime, when he wasn't there, there were also some flowers blooming, and we'll look at some of those later. And when he came back and walked across the Central Valley in the fall, he found that Holocarpa virgata in the fall. And at the same time, there are introduced plants that follow that same cycle from the spring to the fall. In the spring, you get annual grasses, and in the late summer and into the fall, you get the terrible weed, yellow star thistle. Well, this is now being described by the California Native Plant Society in their California Vegetation Program. There's more about California vegetation in their first book than any other source, but they're now taking their methods of describing vegetation and covering the entire state wherever they can get access to describe the vegetation as it really is, not based on some academic theory that was popular at one time and we're learning was based on false premises. This presents a problem to them because vegetation surveys historically all over the world are mostly based on one particular place and one particular time. But as you go from spring through summer to fall, the vegetation changes in especially the areas that are not covered by trees here in California. So you can have one vegetation in the spring, one kind of vegetation in the summer, and a very different kind of vegetation in the fall. And vegetation science isn't used to having to deal with changes like that in time. Well, here's a map of the original extent of California prairie, and you can see that it was very widespread in the middle of California in the Central Valley. But if you look at the map now, the brown in the Central Valley means that that area that John Muir found in the Central Valley is mostly gone. But there are patches of prairie, and in many cases, prairie like John Muir and the early Spanish explorers found it in valleys in the Coast Range and also in the Sierra foothills. So wherever that bright yellow is, that's the areas where California prairie remains. And those are the good places to find wildflowers today. And you notice there's even a few spots in Southern California where there are wildflower super blooms, limited in area, but they can be very spectacular. The best place of all probably is Carrizo Plain, which I pointed out to the Nature Conservancy when I was a student down at Cal Poly. I learned about as one of the best places, like the original Central Valley is seen by John Muir and the early Spanish explorers. It's like a little piece of the original Central Valley in a big valley in the Coast Range. And now after the Nature Conservancy purchased it, they turned it over to the federal agencies, and it's now Carrizo Plain National Monument. And the original fauna has been brought back, like tule elk and pronghorns, working across these bee pastures, just like John Muir saw and described, just like the early Spanish explorers saw and described. And back then, when those people were here, the antelope were still there. Now they have to be reintroduced from the Great Basin, but they're doing just fine after they've been reintroduced to their original home in these bee pastures, which go on just like John Muir described them, as far as you can see in the Carrizo Plain. And here's Phacelia ciliata. It tends to be in the lower parts of the valley, and if you look at it from distance, because of the color, it can actually look like there's a lake down there. And you could see the Phacelia ciliata on the valley, deepest part of the valley floor, looking like a body of water, but that's just solid Phacelia ciliata wildflowers. Well, this is the picture from Carrizo Plain that was used for the cover of the most recent print edition of the Jepson Manual, which is a description of all of the plants in California that grow wild and that were known at that time. This is also from the Carrizo Plain. Quite a variety of colors, quite a variety of wildflowers in one of these super bloom years. Doesn't happen like this every year, but with rains like we're having now, it's quite likely in a month or so, it's going to happen this year. There's some really odd plants in the Carrizo Plains too. There's Carlanthus inflatus with inflated stems and purple flowers. And when Bob Gibbons wanted to have the very first picture in his book about the best place to see wildflowers in the world, he took a picture of a hillside just at the edge of Carrizo Plains, where there was Mentzelia pectinata covering the hillside. And that was his very first picture in his book of the 50 best places to see wildflowers in the world. And when we had an issue of Primatia, the publication of the California Native Plant Society, we used that picture as on the cover of Primatia back in 2011 to describe what then was known about California's prairies and grasslands, the flowers, the ecology, and the animals that made it their home and still make it their home. Well, there are other places to see these. One is Table Mountain, and that's a little different than, it doesn't have clay that keeps the water close to the surface. In this case, it's basaltic rock. This is an old lava flow that when the Central Valley sunk, it was buried under thousands of feet of sediment, but it shows up here, and you can actually see a little bit of the same lava flow in the base of the Coast Range, where the uplift of the Coast Range part of the surface, but there it doesn't form a flat surface like at Table Mountain for wildflowers. So it's just a limited area, but you can see the black rocks on your way driving towards Lake Berryessa. Well, another great place to see wildflowers that's close by and is going to be the center for our wildflower trips is Bear Valley. And this is another area that is like what John Muir saw. Wildflowers as far as you can see. This is Platystemon californicus in the poppy family that covers the whole landscape white on a good year. And other valleys can cover it blue and purple, and in some parts of Bear Valley, it's like this. But one of the things that have been good for these plants are cattle, because the cattle can actually reduce introduced grasses and other weeds that would tend to crowd the natives out. And they take the ecological place that was once filled by the antelope that we saw and Tule elk that are also being introduced around various parts of California, including Carrizo Plains. You go to Carrizo Plains and you can see herds of Tule elk. And there's flowers of all kinds. The one that is on the left, Agathos heterophylla. The one on the right is Leia chrysanthemoides. And here's some of the variety that you get in Bear Valley. If you get a close-up look, you can see lots of variety there in Bear Valley, and that's what we do on these wildflower trips. The plant on the lower left is bird's eye gilia, gilia tricolor. There's the platystemon and the poppy family at the top with the white flowers, and then Lysina californica, yellow on the lower right. And here's the gilia tricolor with the dark center and the light-colored limb in the middle, and then that bright magenta flower. That is Calandrinia ciliata, also known as red maize, which is also surviving in Bear Valley. Here's the platystemon, and then there's another Leia, that's Leia platyglossa on the top. Looks a little bit like the Lysina, but if you look closely, it's related, but not the same plant. Here's the Leia platyglossa up close. You can see it has a teeth on the edges of the ray flowers, the ray parts of the flower, and those are different from the Lysina, which doesn't have the teeth. They're related, but not the same thing. Well, here's the dedication of Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, and this was something that was an idea created around the meeting table of Tuleyome. And we ran with the idea, and we had federal people love the idea, and Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument was created. But unfortunately, there were things left out. Here's Moloch Luyak, or Walker Ridge, after a fire. You notice that you have a kind of a greenish yellow covering the hillsides. Well, that hillside originally was covered by chaparral, but after the fire, it was covered by a big annual herb called Eriophyllum lunatum that covered the whole landscape yellow after the fire. It's been, after a few years, it went away because it was replaced by the chaparral as it started to come back. But for a few years, it was quite a spectacular sight to see. And here it is surrounding that bright yellow. That's the Eriophyllum lunatum. Woolly sunflower is the common name. And there's a little bit of a thistle right in the middle in red. And here's that thistle up close. This is a native California thistle among many, Cirsium occidentale. And up also on the ridge are the adobe lily, Fritillaria pluriflora, plant that is getting way too scarce, but we can still find it up on Walker Ridge, Moloch Luyak. And another beauty up there is red maize, not red maize, excuse me, scarlet pimpernel. And this is Clarkia consina, beautiful Clarkia. And here's a paintbrush in the background and one of the poppies, a close relative, Eschscholzia cespitosa in the foreground. And here's shooting star Dodecathion hendersonii. And here's a real serpentine plant that loves serpentine soils. This is actually a native onion, Allium falcifolium. And then we have fields and fields, not here, but down in Solano County, which is being threatened. These areas are being threatened by this gigantic project that's being proposed by Silicon Valley billionaires to put in the middle of this great wildflower area, vernal pool area, a man-made city that has no public transportation to it, with the idea that it's going to sit there right where the flowers used to be. And here they are up close. This one, once again, is Lausinia californica. And we want to make sure that these flower fields are still around for the youngsters that are seeing for the first time, and they're going to hopefully have kids that will want to see what they saw when they were kids. And this is Plagibothus stipitatus, extending for quite a long ways, not quite as long as what John Muir saw, but still pretty significant. And this is down at the Glide Tuley Ranch as part of the Yolo Bypass in southern Yolo County. And then right in the middle of Yolo County, at not Glide Tuley Ranch, but Glide Ranch, right on the floor of Central Valley, you still have a landscape covered with natives. And these are Hemizonia congesta, the white tar plant, covering the fields right in the middle of the Central Valley. Not too different from what John Muir saw back in 1868, and the early Spanish explorers wrote about hundreds of years before that. Here's that Hemizonia congesta, the white tar plant, up close. Beautiful plant, looks like a field of white stars. And vernal pools are another element. Basically, there are depressions in prairie that fill with water and gradually dry out. And they're not only home to a unique group of wildflowers that are only found in the vernal pools, but they're also home to a unique group of small crustaceans that can only survive there because they're cut off from streams, because where streams are connected to the vernal pools, fish go up the streams and eat the crustaceans, and they can't live. But if they're isolated from the streams as vernal pools, except during the wettest years, the rare miniature crustaceans, fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp, can survive, and they're here. Well, one of the places that got added to the area just south of Walker Ridge is the Bear Valley area, and it was an addition to the Bureau of Land Management areas that eventually, a large part, became Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. But there were people who said that Bear Valley should never be taken over by BLM because it was just ruined and so heavily overgrazed. But when Ellen Dean of UC Davis, the great botanist, looked closely, she found a plant, California macrophylla, that is essentially extinct everywhere else. It was widespread in grazing land all around the Central Valley, but the grazing wasn't heavy enough to eliminate the competition. But with this heavy grazing, the weeds that were crowding it out everywhere else were being pushed aside, and it could still survive in this place people thought was so overgrazed it wasn't worth even being added to federal lands. Well, another place that plants were protected by Tuleyome with the help of lots of other organizations, including the city of Woodland, is Woodland Regional Park and Preserve. It includes one of the rarest plants in the world. This is Chloropyron palmatum, palmate birdspeak. Through our excellent management now that Woodland Regional Park and Preserve, and it's preserved for this plant more than anything else. It's a federally endangered plant. The population has doubled under the management of Tuleyome and our allies there at Woodland Regional Park and Preserve. And another very rare plant that is not as common there, and needs more federal protection is alkali milkvetch, Astragalus tenor. And we're trying to protect it in a vernal pool on the outside of Davis, and its small amount is protected at Woodland Regional Park and Preserve as well. Well, in the time in the late summer, excuse me, the late spring and early summer, at the time when John Muir was up in the Yosemite Valley, you can still see flowers. Here's a whole hillside of golden mariposa lily, Calochortus luteus, and a whole field of a plant in the hibiscus family, Sedelcia diplocypha. And pretty late in spring, Tritilia laxa, Trifolium variegatum. This is once again in spring. This is Ariantha. Excuse me. Gotta check my notes here to make sure I get you the right name. Yeah, Rhyphoceria ariantha is the right name. And it was included in the early books among the monkey flowers, but now the monkey flowers have been divided up into actually different families. And so this is Rhyphoceria, beautiful plant. And here it is up close, amazing little plant. Still can be found in the Central Valley. And here's another plant that called meadowfoam, Limnanthes alba, that you can still find in low wet places, kind of like beginning vernal pools in the Central Valley in the right places. And here's one of the world's rarest plants, another federally protected plant. It has the common name Contra Costa goldfields. It's Leucaena conjugans, but it's essentially extinct in the county it's named after, but here's a nice little population that's protected in Solano County, another area that is potentially threatened by that Flannery project. And here's a plant that is one of those native wildflowers that's a little bit more safe from disturbance because it actually likes disturbance, so much so that it's become a weed in Australia. And you can find it in areas that are more disturbed than virtually anywhere else here in California, but it's still a beautiful native wildflower. And here's a plant related to that red ribbons, the Clarkia consina, but this one is not so bright, but it's one of the last wildflowers to appear, and because of that, its common name is farewell to spring, the last wildflower of spring to appear. And here's Castellia certa, another one that was lumped in with the owl owl's clover, but not so closely related as people once thought. And unlike purple needlegrass, that was supposedly, according to the theorists, all over the Central Valley, here's a flower that survives in the same ecological situation that purple needlegrass was supposedly found, right in the middle of the floor of the Central Valley in an area that wasn't quite disturbed enough to destroy it. It's unlike a lot of the Central Valley plants, perennial plant closely related to sunflower, but a really good native. Another one that is here in the valley and also in the foothills is Media elegans, related to those some of those plants we saw in Bear Valley. Another plant that actually can show up in midsummer when John Muir was up in the Yosemite Valley is this perennial lupin, Lupinus bicolor. And here it is blooming right in very late spring, very early summer, doing just fine in the Central Valley, at least at the edges where we're starting to get some slope. Although I found it also in the very floor of the Central Valley where it can still survive in a few places. Here it is, a close-up. Beautiful lupin, but unlike our most familiar lupins, this one's a perennial. And that's one reason it can draw on enough water to bloom quite late in the growing season for most California plants. So we have these beautiful hillsides of color that are unlike anything on Earth. Things that places that Bob Gibbons described as among the most beautiful places to see wildflowers anywhere on our planet, our oasis in space, that we have so much beauty if we just protect it and keep it alive. It's threatened by urban growth. Here's Criteria lex in the foreground and urbanization in the background. But it also needs to be appreciated. I was shown this slide by an ecology professor that because these hillsides weren't covered with purple needlegrass, he said, oh, these are just worthless weeds that we don't need to consider. This hillside's been ruined because all the purple needlegrass that Clements described as belonging there can't be found. But we have something here special, as Bob Gibbons noticed, something unlike any place else on Earth, something right at our fingertips, something that is valuable and needs to be protected. It's not just non-native annual grass, as has often been just described as just a free fire zone for development and destruction. It's one of the most unique ecosystems on Earth, and we have it right here at our fingertips to protect. And we've got a team to protect it here. On the right is Bob Schneider, the founder of Tuleyome. To his left, with her arm around his shoulder, is Sandy Schubert, our executive director. On the far left is Nick Jensen, the conservation chairman of state CNPS. And kind of in the middle, that's me. So California has 4,839 native plants in a recent count, and more than 39 million people. Both are the most of any state. So conservation here is a real challenge. We could really use your help. If you'd like to help, please contact me, Dr. Glen Holstein, Tuleyome, California Native Plant Society, Yolo-Calusa chapter at Holstein at cal.net. And that's the end of my talk. And welcome. Do we still have time for a few questions, Jeff?
Yeah, we sure do. Yeah, thank you so much, Glenn, for a great talk and lots of wonderful pictures there. So, talks like this one are supported by donations from viewers like you. So if you haven't done so already and are able to, we would greatly appreciate a small donation to help us keep this lecture series going. I'll put that link in the chat there. So we do have time for some questions. So you can either raise your hand on Zoom and unmute yourself and ask, or you can type the question in the chat, and I will be happy to relay it to Glenn here. So I will start off with the questions. So one thing I noticed in a lot of the pictures you showed of big blooms, and I've seen myself up in Table Mountain especially, you see these big blocks of color. So it seems to be lots of one type of wildflower in one area, and then a little ways away, it's a bunch of another species. Is that also due to the underlying soil, like you were talking about with the oaks versus grassy hillsides, or what's driving that?
Very much so. It's very much related to how that water that falls when it's too cold for plants to grow in the winter, and then when the water starts to run out and it gets warm enough for plants to grow, and they have this brief moment in time to get the water that's stored. And where that's stored, whether it's stored down deep or close to the surface, is really what determines the vegetation. And then on a smaller scale, like on Table Mountain, it could just be slight changes in thickness of the soil material that's starting to form on top of the lava on Table Mountain. So there, the changes are very subtle, and they happen very quickly, but they're very much in some ways like the large-scale changes when you see completely different kinds of vegetation on hillsides in the same climate, but looking very different.
Great. And then we had a question in the chat earlier on when you were showing your Carrizo Plain photos. And Robert was commenting that he had been down there during some super blooms and was expecting to see a lot more bees flying around than he did. And was wondering if those annuals down there are all bee pollinated or if there's something else that's doing the pollination.
Well, most of them are bee pollinated. And one of the reasons that so many of them are very showy is that bees can see and uh, they like pretty wildflowers, and that it does attract them. However, the native bees are not as showy. They're not the honeybees that we're used to seeing, and they're not even, for the most part, the big bees like the carpenter bees that we're used to seeing. Some of them are even smaller than your average housefly. So you may find a plant that is needing those bees for pollination, but you may not notice the pollination because the bees are much smaller than what you're used to seeing. Also, by the way, it's a very important thing when you're conserving areas to not just go where, for example, a vernal pool is, but you need to preserve the uplands around the vernal pool because the bees make their homes, the pollinating bees that are native, make their homes underground. And if you disturb the upland around a vernal pool, you can wipe out the pollinators that the vernal pool flowers need because the homes are up high and the flowers are down low in the pool.
Okay. Question from the chat asking about where they might find the Clements map that you used in your slides. Is that online somewhere? Is that from a book?
Well, I actually have it online for to the extent that my talks are online. I always show it in my talks. I'm going to give another talk in person at the library in Davis and the Blanchard Room this coming Monday night at 6 p.m. And this one's going to be in person. It's going to not be identical to this talk. It's going to cover more the entire prairie ecosystem, like I talked about to some extent here. It'll be somewhat similar, but there'll be some new things that I didn't cover tonight. And we'll show that again. And the actual source of that is an old book by Clements and a collaborator that was published way back around the time of the First World War. So this has been going on a long time, but that was out of this old book that had this great map that showed how California's Central Valley was gerrymandered out of Nebraska. Great map. It tells the story of what happened and why California's been so misunderstood for so long.
All right. So another question in the chat asking about lupinous bicolor and whether that's an annual or a perennial.
Lupinous bicolor is an annual, and it is quite a variable annual. There's some that are really tiny and stick close to the ground. Others are kind of showy. And there's another related lupin that gets even showier, Lupinus nanus, and that's called the sky lupin. It's so beautiful, but it's not quite as abundant as Lupinus bicolor.
And then what was the perennial lupin?
That was Lupinus formosus, and there are lots of perennial lupins in the mountains, but that's about the only perennial lupin that gets down at sea level. So it's kind of unusual to have a perennial lupin down here on the valley floor. If you go up into Yosemite Valley, there'll be lupins, and almost all of them will be perennial because the perennials do better in colder climates because it enables them to survive the cold winters. But down in the at sea level, the perennials are not nearly as common.
Terry is asking, can you elaborate a little bit on why trees like oaks aren't able to grow in those clay-heavy soils that hold the water higher up?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons is that clay not only keeps the water at the surface, but that layer of water and clay at the surface prevents good oxygen flow down to roots, and plant roots need abundant oxygen. And woody plants especially don't do well without good oxygenation of the roots. And that's one reason you can actually, if you put too much soil material around the base of a plant, a woody plant that you're planting, it can shut off the oxygen to the roots and it won't do well.
Interesting. All right. Do we have any final questions for Glenn before we wrap things up here? All right. Well, if you'd like to meet Glenn in person and see some wildflowers, come on out to our Spring Thing event or sign up for one of our wildflower tours. We'd love to see all of you out there. All right. Thanks for coming, everyone, and hope to see you for next month's Nature and You lecture, which will be on the Quail Ridge Nature Preserve.